Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
You are listening to The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak, connecting the reality of the gospel to the grit of life. You can support the podcast at patreon.com/Noah Filipiak or at noahfilipiak.com/give.
What is up? Welcome to episode 21 of the Flip Side podcast. Hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. I did. Headed down to Ohio for 4 days. Hung out with my family. Did a half marathon with my brother Pete yesterday. My legs are still very sore. Well, if you listen to episode 20 of The Flip Side, interviewed my friend Jason Redouty on grace and addiction. Encourage you to check it out. Jason is a big fan of the show. Thanks, Jason. He is one of the Flip Side, and then that's the problem. See, Jason brought up that there needs to be a name for the Flip Side blank. The Flip Side. And so if you listen to that episode, he gave some ideas, and then afterwards he texted me more ideas, some the same, most all ridiculous. So I'm going to go through them with you, see what you think. The people who listen to the Flip Side, the fans of the Flip Side, Flip Nation, the Flipsters, the Flipmo Squad, the Flip Flops, the Flappers, the Flubsters. Again, Jason typed each of these into his phone and texted them to me, okay? So there was an amount of thought that went into texting each one of these words. The Flubsters. The Sons of Flubber. Noah's Arks. Okay, that was his list. So what do you think? You gotta wonder. Sons of Flubber. I don't know where that one... Welcome to episode 21. Welcome, Sons of Flubber. So then, our friend Seth, also a listener of the Flip Side, also a son of Flubber, he texted us and said the listeners of the Flip Side should be called the Flipped Off. The Flipped Off. So I don't know if that one is going to stick, Seth. Jason also thought that the Fliptometrists then would be an appropriate name. So I think right now what's leading for me, and I use the word leading very loosely. I'm not sure I could, with a straight face, use any name for Flipside listeners in a straight-faced, real context when I start a show or throughout the show. But I love Flippopotamuses, where you could be the Flippos and full name the Flippopotamuses. And Jason mentioned he would wear with pride a button that said he was a Flippopotamus. And so I can see a little bit behind that. You know, we talk about Patreon, and by the way, shout out to Patreon supporters. You are a huge help to me. Certain days when I bust out the podcast, I do it for you. And so I appreciate you a lot. So I could see one of these Patreon bonuses where you sign up and then you get a Flippopotamus button, and I can only imagine what the Flippopotamus logo could potentially be. So chew on that. Let me know what you think. You can always email the show, podcast@beyondthebattle.net. Maybe you have some other ideas, some better ideas. Maybe you like one of those ideas. Let me know, and we'll see what this turns into. So my 8-year-old daughter's birthday was the end of November, and the last couple years, particularly last year around Christmas time, she really, really wanted an Elf on the Shelf. Some of her friends from school had them. You're probably familiar with Elf on the Shelf. Essentially, if not, essentially it's this stuffed toy elf, and it comes with a book, and every night you as a parent are supposed to move the elf, and you put it in a funny location in the house where it did something funny, and the kids wake up and they see this location, and it's great, and they look forward to it. And my daughter has wanted us to get one. My wife has been resistant to getting one because she didn't want the extra work of having to think of something funny every day, every night, I should say, to put the elf. So, my daughter's birthday this year, we broke down. I thought it would be a gift that she would love to get her this elf for her birthday. And so we actually aside to that story, we didn't technically give it to her on her birthday. We gave it to her as an incentive to getting her flu shot. I don't know about any of you, but my daughter, both of my oldest kids, 8-year-old and 6-year-old, they lose their mind when it's time to get the flu shot. I mean, lose their mind. For my daughter dreads it year round. She brings it up and talks about it. When it's time to get the flu shot, I feel at the doctor, I feel like an abusive parent. I also feel like the worst. I feel so embarrassed for the doctor and the nurse that has to do this. We literally have to, I hold down my daughter's upper body while they scream. I mean, scream in this doctor's office. It is really, honestly, I joke about it. It's a horrible experience as a parent. And for them as well, while the nurse holds down their legs and sticks them with the shot in their legs. So we wrapped up the Elf on the Shelf. We even told my daughter what it was and said, you'll get this if you're brave during your flu shot. She was not brave at all. Let me just say that. Again, as a bad parent, we gave it to her anyways. I reconciled the situation because she legitimately, maybe this was a step of growth, she legitimately felt bad afterwards about how she acted and wanted to apologize to the nurse. And so she did, and so therefore I gave her the Elf on the Shelf still. Maybe that's progress. I don't know. But back to the Elf on the Shelf. So now she has one, and we told her it didn't come alive until December 1st because she's just anxiously awaiting. But here's the thing that I didn't realize about elves on the shelves, specifically my 8-year-old daughter. There's a book that comes along with it, and the book says that it's magical. So basically the elf it's real creepy. You know, the elf is basically watching you, watching if you're good and well-behaved, and you just think about how, and then the elf at night, they go and report to Santa if you've been good or bad, and they also report to Santa your wish list and what you want for Christmas and all these things. It really makes you pause about the whole Santa Claus thing, this extremely manipulative way of trying to get our kids to behave, extremely legalistic. It fills them with all this merit-based love. Well, if I'm good, then I will get these things, and if I'm bad, I'll get coal or whatever. So here's the thing. My daughter, she really believes that this elf is real. She genuinely believes it is magical. See, in the book, it says that if you touch the elf, it loses its magic. And then if it loses its magic, it will not be able to tell Santa your gifts, and you will not get them for Christmas. And so my 6-year-old, we get the elf, and she just wants to play with the elf, because that's how my 6-year-old is. She sees a toy, she wants to play with the toy. My 8-year-old, again, loses her mind. Do not touch the elf. She comes and tattles on her sister all the time and says, you know, my sister, she wants to touch the elf. She can't touch the elf. It's magical. We haven't even gotten into the elf yet. And it's becoming this huge issue between the sister that wants to play with the elf and the sister that firmly believes it's magical and that you cannot touch the elf. And the thing is, my 8-year-old also believes with equal conviction that Santa Claus is actually real. Now, listen, since the day my daughter was birthed from the womb, I have been telling her Santa Claus is not real, okay? I tell her it is a lie made up by parents to try to get their kids to behave. I've read to her the history of where Santa Claus comes from. I let her know that mom and dad buy every single present and how ridiculous it is that Santa could bring the presents. And somehow along the way, she has become convinced Santa Claus is real. She is a passionate, zealous evangelist against me or towards me of Santa Claus being real. It used to be funny that I would joke that Santa Claus wasn't real. I no longer do that because I get yelled at, and I mean yelled at, that Santa Claus is real. So now I just say he's real to not get yelled at. She will then ask me, do you really think he's real, or are you just saying that? And I, to not cause issues, I just have to say, can we talk about something else? Can you bring up something else? This is the point that Santa Claus is in our house. We had night 1 of Elf on the Shelf last night. It's fun to do it. I'm a creative person, and my wife is as well, and it's fun for us to think of places to put the elf. But I have to admit, I am a little disturbed at my daughter's naivety and how she so easily believes that this is real no matter what I tell her. So there you go. That's my Elf on the Shelf story. I'll probably keep you updated on the Elf on the Shelf and the many traumatic fights that Santa Claus brings into my house. But I'll get in trouble for this, but I do live with 4 women, and I have come to the conclusion that it is often easier to just keep my mouth shut. With any of the 4 you pick, it is often easier to keep my mouth shut around debates like Santa Claus than poke the bear, which I used to think was fun, and I've learned my lesson. I've learned my lesson that sometimes it's best to keep the peace. So I'm sure you'll get updated on that throughout the month of December here on The Flip Side Podcast, as you continue to listen as a devoted Flippopotamus. How'd that one go over, Jason? So the book club is up and running. The best place to keep up on the Flip Side Book Club is at noahfilipiak.com. Love doing the book club. It gets me reading. It's getting me blogging. I do need the help. Like I said, Patreon helps me to put out podcast episodes. The book club, where you can volunteer to join me in reading a book. This time, the first book club, and hopefully first of many, we are reading Mere Sexuality by Todd A. Wilson. Feel free to jump in late if you'd like to, but it gets me reading, it gets you reading, it gets me learning, and it gets me putting out more blog posts, which I don't do as much as I used to, and I don't do as much as I would like. So, put out number 2 on Friday. We are now through chapter 3 of the book. Definitely encourage you to check Mere Sexuality out if you're looking for a theological approach to sexuality. Wilson uses a broader definition of sexuality. The best way I can put it in sort of layman's terms, or in the way, I mean, the book is in layman's terms. It's not super above your head. It is theological. It is a good biblical map for sexuality. But I would say Wilson, in his definition of sexuality, uses 3 categories, for lack of a better word. One would be gender, and you would include the transgender debate of today into that category of gender. Another would be homosexuality versus heterosexuality, LGBTQ+, and that conversation. And then third would be probably the wrong term for it, but I wrote down in my blog sexual purity, this idea of sort of what Beyond the Battle would be about. What do heterosexuals as well as homosexual or same-sex attracted people struggle with? But, pornography, lust, infidelity, those sorts of things, and what is God's design for sex. So the book covers all of those things, and I would say of the things I've read, I haven't read a lot of things out there about gender, male, female, and what the Bible says about that, and what is a theological approach to that. And I would say at this point, that is one of the strongest points of the book. So as far as a resource goes, and so I'm encouraged. I'm looking forward to continuing to read through the book, and we'll give you little blurb updates here on the blog, and we'll write in more detail at noahflipiak.com, where you are, of course, welcome to follow along. The book gets into tons of controversial issues, and so happy to interact with you here on the podcast if you want to email in, or on the blog in the blog comments about any number of controversial issues that Wilson approaches. Last but not least, we will jump into the mailbag. I have mentioned there is a email that you can reach the show. It is podcast@beyondthebattle.com. Let's jump into the mailbag.
Mail time. Mail time. Mail time.
All right, so for today's mailbag, we are continuing our segment within a segment with Rob's email about small groups. He had written in a while ago, episode 13. I asked for feedback on your experience in small group, and Rob wrote a great email in. It was long, and it was too late for that episode, but a lot of really good stuff, so I've been breaking it up along several mailbags along the way. But essentially, Rob shares how he was living a double life, and he was in a lot of small groups where he blames himself, but he didn't show his double life. He put on a mask. But also how many of our traditional church approaches to small groups tend to not encourage a double life, but encourage putting on that mask. And so his email gets into a lot of those sorts of things, and he lays out 5 different experiences he's had in small groups. Today we're going to hit number 3. If you want number 2 and number 1, listen to the last 2 Flipside episodes. Number 3, this type of small group experience he calls the coward. Husband won't lead. Yes, also me. I can picture it like yesterday. The conversation in the small group finally heats up, and husbands and wives are sharing around the room. My wife is hoping with anxious anticipation that I will make her proud by adding deep meaning and spiritual leadership to the conversation, almost raising my hand for me to speak, just hoping that today will be the day that I step into the responsibility that I signed up for on our wedding day. I can feel her anticipation and her disappointment when the conversation is too deep for my shame-filled heart that has secret sin, and won't allow me to have moral standing within the conversation. Even these failed moments produce self-shame and internal disappointment, further driving me to either 1, act out, or 2, fix it on my own. Recipe for disaster, and ultimately not the way to defeat sin and shame. The small groups I attend today, I often wonder whether guys are facing the same internal shame when they aren't able to become vulnerable and share their hearts, fears, and emotions within small group. While I don't want to project my past sin life into others, the reality is that a huge percentage of men struggle with unwanted sexual behavior. I've become more adept at seeing me in others, and now have the emotional capacity to follow up, ask the tough questions, and extend grace when guys are struggling. So I hope that gets you thinking about your community experiences, about your small group experiences, as well as about your life experience as a believer, whether you're a man or a woman. Do you have people that you can share with vulnerability about what Rob describes, unwanted sexual behavior, about any sort of unwanted behavior, about the real deep stuff of life, and or are you contributing to a small group setting where we just put on a mask and talk about surface level stuff, maybe head knowledge, cognitive, Bible-y stuff, where prayer requests are about your job, they're about your family members, they're about health, and that's about it. And so episode 13 gets into that a lot, get you thinking, because the church as a whole, all of us as men and women, we need vulnerability. We need relationships where we can be real, where grace can invade that shame, where we can be reminded of who we are as sons and daughters of the Father, fully loved, perfect in his sight because of Jesus. And so many of our church small group experiences do not embody that. And I would love for the flip side to be a place where we can chip away at that, of that culture. Maybe that's the right word. To chip away at that culture and bring a new culture both to the church and to our individual lives. So thanks, Rob, for that email. We'll continue. There's 2 more examples that he gives in the next 2 mailbags. If you would like to contribute to the mailbag, you are more than welcome. I would love to hear from you. You can email the show, podcast@beyondthebattle.net. That is the end of the mailbag. And why is it beyondthebattle.net rather than .com or even the more attractive .org? Well, I'll tell you why. .com, people go around and they buy all the .coms and they don't even use them, these companies. It's mean. It's crooked. They buy them. They buy a phrase or wording that somebody might want, like Beyond the Battle. And then they buy it and they own the .com. It's not a domain company that you buy the domain from for $20 a year or whatever. These are companies that buy these names and they literally hoard them. They do nothing with them except hold them literally for ransom. And then if you want the name beyondthebattle.com, you have to pay for it from them. $5,000, $10,000. And I got to tell you, beyondthebattle.com was not worth $10,000 to buy. Beyondthebattle.org, I don't think you're allowed to buy the org ones. And so that sounded good and cool. And there's another organization that uses that. So that was taken. So all that was left was .net. That's what I did. So there you go. Now you know a useless bit of trivia that you never really wondered about. You never really cared about. Onward we go on episode 21 of the Beyond the Battle podcast. Next, we're going to talk about depression. That's going to be our topic of the day. All right. So with depression, I don't claim to be a doctor, a psychologist. I have not researched and studied depression. I do suffer from depression or have been diagnosed with depression. So I speak from my own experience as well as the experience of a pastor and the importance that I have found in talking about depression and how much that helps people with depression. And even back to Rob's point about shame, and we bring that up a lot on the podcast, depression is another subject where people feel a lot of shame around depression. Again, this is not a academic study, but I know based on someone close to me who grew up's the wrong word, but who in the 70s and 80s was in the prime of their career and struggling with serious depression. And I don't mean to minimalize one type of depression or another, or even stigmatize, maybe that's the better word. I would say I struggle with mild depression. What I mean is I've never had suicidal thoughts. For the most part, I can function, go to work when I'm having one of these episodes, those sorts of things. There's other individuals that, it's completely debilitating in having to be hospitalized sometimes, these sorts of things. So anyway, this individual who's close to me, their prime of their career was 70s and the 80s, and during that time and their career was in the Christian ministry world, And you did not talk about depression back then. And if you were alive back then, you could probably relate to that. You didn't bring it up. And if you did, it was treated with, well, ignorance, really. People didn't know what it was. But this individual describes people praying that demons would be exorcised out of him. The idea that your depression is a direct result of your sin, as if it's the punishment for your sin, or that depression itself is a sin. And I think that's what a lot of people got exposed to in the 70s and 80s and bleeding into the 90s, and I'm sure in pockets even still to this day, where if you have depression, and throughout this conversation, I will lump anxiety in as well. Anxiety and depression are two different things. They're closely related, though. They often go together, not always. For me, they have, and they do. So if you struggle with depression or anxiety, it often can be communicated to you, or maybe has been communicated to you, that is the same as struggling with, name your sin, pornography, some sort of selfishness, lying, depression, right? And so the shame you feel, it's this feeling like I can't talk about depression because people will just tell me really bad advice. Don't be depressed. Have more faith. Don't choose not to feel that way. You're sad, but you're a Christian. You have salvation. Where are the fruits of the Spirit in your life? And so why would I bring this up in a Christian setting when I'm only going to get lectured or preached at or looked down on as a result? And so what I have found is really helpful is we need to talk about depression. We need to talk about counseling. And it's funny because if you think about how often the Bible talks about counsel, it's a lot in different iterations of counsel, and just how we can't do life alone and we need other people. We need to seek counsel. We need to seek wisdom. And here in our society, we have people who full-time, professional job, schooling, expertise, research, experience is counselor. Their job is to counsel. And yet there's this stigma, oh, I can't go to a counselor because then people will think that I have issues, or then people will think I have problems. Then people will think I need counsel. Well, I do need counsel. If Proverbs would call someone who thinks they don't need counsel a fool, and that's really what a person is. If you think you don't need counsel, you're a fool. If you think you've got it all figured out and you don't need any help and you don't have any struggles and you don't have any weaknesses, you're prideful, you're arrogant, you're a fool. And I mean, forgive me, that's a little strong to say. I need to be more gracious in how I say that, but you're living in a world, a really unhealthy place. If that's you, you're living in a place that isn't real. You're living with a mask on, and probably, and you're living in that place of shame. You're just, you have those issues, you have those struggles, but you could never share them with anyone. And I'm not going to come down on you hard that you feel like you can never share them with anyone, because you've probably are looking back at your past life, and whenever you've shown weakness before, that has been responded to by others, maybe trusted individuals, with harm or abuse or with hurt, or you are mocked or ridiculed, or that weakness was used against you. And so there's certainly legitimate, deep reasons why we don't share our weakness. But again, on the flip side, I want to use this episode to push you towards a place of grace, to push you towards a place of saying, in grace, it is safe to share your weakness. And that's where real healing is going to happen. And so I'm a huge believer in counseling. I'm a huge believer in being vulnerable and sharing this stuff with other people, whether it's your sin struggles or it's an anxiety or a depression struggle. In many ways, the similar thread is let's be real. Let's be vulnerable. Let's talk about the real world we live in. Huge pet peeve of mine, sermon after sermon, across churches, across denominations. These sermons, they don't get to the real life where people live. I remember growing up, and if there was and it's not all about the subject of sexuality and pornography and things like that, but for me, growing up, I remember if there was a pie chart, if you can picture a pie graph of the percentage of things I struggled with as a teenager, 98% of that pie chart would have been a struggle with pornography. That was and that was the one subject my church never talked about. And I'm not saying every sermon needs to be about pornography or whatever it might be, but what I'm saying is there is a trend. It is a plague across the church in sermons and in the culture of small groups where we are all trained, conditioned to not talk about real things. And we talk about the gospel, which is good, and how to be saved and go to heaven, and that's good. And sometimes there will be sermons that might address anxiety, and that's good, but we still aren't going to share in a personal way our own struggles with anxiety and in a group setting, our own struggles and weaknesses there. But many sermons about how to be successful and how to even to persevere through hard times, because life is hard. And those are all important, but they don't hit on the real, here's what I'm really dealing with when I'm alone. The percentage, the depression percentages today are higher than they have ever been. The anxiety percentages today are higher than they've ever been. The suicide rate today is higher than it has ever been. And if you look at our culture and the conquest of technology, the triumph, I should say, of technology, you would look at the latest iPhone commercial and you would think we live in a utopia. You have everything you ever could need with the technology that we have. And we know for the vast majority of us, even homeless people in the United States can get access to 3 hot meals a day and shelter over their head at night. We live in the most luxurious culture that has ever existed, and yet depression, anxiety, suicide are all on the rise at unprecedented rates. And in the church, we don't talk about this stuff. Like, it drives me crazy. And in the church, we don't talk about pornography and sexual purity and lust and our fantasies and our discontent with our marriages or our discontent with our singleness. It drives me nuts. And not only are people suffering because we're not talking about it, and look, the Bible goes here. It's just that we only take the Bible to surface level depth. We don't plunge the Bible the way the Bible is written to be plunged. But not only do people not receive healing because these things aren't being talked about, it creates the shame culture. Because if you never hear a sermon on pornography, why would you talk about pornography to fellow Christians? If you never hear a sermon on depression, why would you ever talk to others about depression? And I'm not saying that a pastor has to have a pornography testimony. Though, let's be honest. If your pastor is a guy and he's under the age of, 45, he probably has some experience with pornography. And if he's over the age of 45, it's likely he does as well. Just wouldn't have grown up in the internet age, but has something he can share about struggling with sexual purity in some way or another. And I'm not saying your pastor has to be diagnosed with depression to be able to talk about these things, but to talk about when you have felt low, when you have felt down, when God has felt distance from you. And if it's not you, then get someone else on the stage, another church leader, an elder in the church, a leader in the church that has overcome or is going through struggles with depression, anxiety, pornography, discontentment in their relational or sexual life. These are the real issues people are struggling with. If the leaders in the church are too full of shame or too fake or too afraid or whatever it might be to talk about these things, of course people in the pews aren't going to talk about them, because we have told them, we have taught them, church is not the place to talk about these things. Satan wins. I hate that. Can you hear me? Can you feel it? Ah! Oh, seriously. Oh my gosh. And so, yes, please be a vulnerable person. Join me in see, this is where, Jason, I can't say join me, Flippos, and being vulnerable. Maybe if it was Flip Nation, I could say join me, Flip Nation, and being vulnerable, being leaders in vulnerability. Maybe I could have two, one for more serious contexts and one for more ridiculous. But that's a passion of mine. You're going to see it in my writing. You're going to see it in my podcasting. If you're a pastor, I hope you hear me. Just take that risk. Take that step. Take that step, please. And when you do, I'm telling you, people come up to you and they say, thank you for being vulnerable. Thank you for sharing that. I struggle with that too. And now I feel comfortable getting help. I feel comfortable going to counseling. I see you as a safe person. Is that not what we want in the church? We want that type of healing to happen. And leaders in the church, you have such a privilege and an obligation and responsibility to be trailblazers there. Do not back down from that calling that God has put on your life. And if you're not a leader in the church, be a subversive prophet in the church, where in the small group, in the one-on-ones, in what you write about on social media, be vulnerable and make the change from the inside out that people would say, there is another way. We can talk about these things. All right, so back to the topic of depression. That was a bit of a tangent, but obviously it relates. If you look at depression itself, the Bible talks about depression. I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow, verse by verse where the Bible talks about depression, but I often am drawn to the Psalms. And if you struggle with depression, man, read the Psalms. You'll find you are not alone. You will find that the psalmist wrestled with the full gamut of emotion before God. If you read Psalm 88, no joke, so in this context, this will sound like a funny sentence. It's one of the most depressing chapters in the whole Bible. And Psalm 88, but I say that in a good way. I say that it gives you permission. A lot of times the Psalms, and this isn't a bad thing either, they'll be very depressing, and then there'll be a redemptive line in the Psalms. There is very little redemptive line in Psalm 88. Maybe the first half of verse 1 is somewhat redemptive. The rest of it is just dreadful. I say that as somebody who struggles with depression. I'm overwhelmed with troubles. My life draws near to death. I am like one without strength, like the slain who lie in the grave, who you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have taken from me my closest friends. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call out to you, Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. I'm skipping through as I go through it. It's a little bit longer. But I where does he say? Oh, here it is. Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? I have borne your terrors. I am in despair. All day long they surround me like a flood. They've completely engulfed me. You ready for redemption? When is it coming? There's only one verse left in the psalm. You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. We need to know that depression, and varying stages of it, varying intensities, and it's going to be different from person to person and context to context, but depression is a part of the biblical account of following God. It's part of God's It's a part of our experience with a faithful God. It doesn't mean that God isn't faithful anymore. If you are brought up in a church where you can never be depressed and you can never be sad because God is faithful and buck up and have joy, then when you feel depressed, you will naturally feel like God is no longer faithful. Or on the other side, you will feel like you are a bad Christian and you've done something wrong and therefore you don't have the joy that you should have. Depression, we know, is an imbalance in brain chemicals. Depression as a diagnosis is similar. I don't want to say similar. Again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a scientist here. But it would be like being diagnosed with, name any other imbalance in your body, whether that was a cancer or it was a debilitating disease of some kind. There's an imbalance going on. In this particular case, it's in your brain, and there's these different levels in your brain that they can test for, and even testing your blood and all these measurements, and you can be low in an area, and oftentimes that area is treatable, sometimes with medication. And depression is a very complex animal. There's life circumstances that bring on depression in greater intensities. There's chronic depression that never really goes away. There's severe depression. There's mild depression. There's seasonal affective disorder. I mean, it's a very, very complicated thing. But what I want us to be able to do is to be able to talk about depression. Elijah in 1 Kings 19, in 1 Kings 18, he just performs one of the greatest victories of God, one of the greatest miracles in the Bible. 1 Kings 19, Jezebel wants to kill him, and Elijah is so depressed. He is before God under the broom tree, and he just wants to die. He cries out to God, and he wants God to take his life. Men and women of the faith who have come before us have struggled with depression. The Bible can be confusing on depression. Again, I will lump in anxiety here because they often go together. Paul says in Philippians 4, 6-7, you're probably familiar with this passage. It preaches well. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. That's a challenging text. I mean, challenging. What do we do with that text? Paul makes it sound like we can't be anxious, or don't be anxious, like as if I just get to choose. Okay, I feel anxious. All right, choose not to be anxious. All right, cool, I'm not anxious anymore. And in that choosing, if I pray, if I petition to God, if I give him my requests with thanksgiving, verse 7 says, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Now, a couple interesting things about this verse. See, this verse can just produce more shame if you're struggling with anxiety or you're struggling with depression. If you switch over to 2 Corinthians, which is another book written by Paul, same author, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 28, he just finished listing off all these terrible things that have happened to him. In danger from bandits, in danger in the city, in danger in the country. I've labored and toiled. I've gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst. I've gone without food. Just all these terrible things that have happened to Paul. All these physical things. Verse 28, besides everything else, so besides these physical things, the NIV says, I face the daily pressure of my concern for all the churches. And if you just read that, the daily pressure of concern, you think, oh, no big deal. If you read the ESV, it's a more accurate translation of the Greek word. It says, apart from, verse 28, apart from all other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. The word in verse 28 is the same Greek word used for anxiety as anxious back in Philippians 4, verse 6. So here Paul is saying, do not be anxious about anything. And he gives you a formula. If you pray, you're going to feel this peace. And so there you go. There's your formula for anxiety. You don't need to go to counseling. You just need to do this. You don't need medication. You just need to do this. This same exact guy, Paul, who says, do not be anxious about anything, he says there's daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Anxiety is weighing down upon him because of what is going on in all the churches. Well, Paul, just give that to Jesus. Cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. And the peace of God will transcend all understanding. He says it's daily. Paul struggled with daily anxiety. Do you understand how normative this was to his faith? I would even say if Paul didn't care about the churches, he wouldn't have struggled with this anxiety. If Paul hadn't taken huge faith risks and had went on a limb for God in these ways, he wouldn't have struggled with anxiety. It's not the more you have faith, the less anxiety you have. In Paul's case, the more faith he had, the more risky things he did. That's where his daily anxiety came from. So we have to be slow to generate a formula that if you feel anxious, you can pray it away and you'll have the peace of God. So what do we do with Philippians 4, 6, and 7? To me, verse 7 is indicative of what to do. It says, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Paul does say, do not be anxious about anything. I think none of us want to be anxious. It doesn't explicitly say that we'll feel the peace as if the anxiety will be replaced with the peace. What does it say exactly? It says the peace of God will guard our hearts. And what else will it guard? What's it say? Our minds. Anxiety and depression, they live in the heart and the mind. When you pray, in every situation, pray and petition God and give him your thanks and thank him for what he has given you and present your requests to God. And what will happen? His peace will guard your heart. His peace will guard your mind. Your mind might be riddled with anxiety. The question is there this knight with the armor on and the sword and the shield and the dragon is pressing in upon you? Is there this strong, fierce knight that is the peace of God that is saying, no, you can't have this heart. No, you can't have this mind because I am guarding it. They've come before me with this prayer and this petition, and I've got it covered, and I'm in control, and they may not feel it at this time because, like Paul, it might be a daily anxiety that they feel, but that doesn't mean that I'm not here. It doesn't mean I'm not faithful, and it doesn't mean I'm not guarding them. The peace of God lives here. The peace of God rules here. Satan, you are a liar. Go away. And the shield is there, and the sword is there, defending you from Satan's attacks on you, defending your heart and your mind, even if your heart and mind are still wrestling with depression and anxiety. Boom. I think that's what this text is telling us about anxiety. And I experienced that in my life. In fact, one of the most helpful things in my therapy is when your mind is what's the word? I can't think of it. It'll come to me later. Ruminating. When your mind is ruminating on something. So you're laying in bed and you're thinking about this for Paul, it was the daily pressure of the churches. And oh my goodness, there's so much stuff in a church to be ruminating about. Oh, this person's mad at me. And will this program go well? And is everybody going to leave? And are we going to be able to pay our bills? And I have this conflict with this person and there needs to be reconciliation. And then there's these people in the church and they have this conflict with each other and I have to help reconcile them. And this person doesn't like me and this person's spreading rumors about me and all these things. And so what I'm able to do with the help of professional therapy, and it goes right on line with Scripture, is to remind myself of what is true, What is true about God? What is true about this situation? Because when in my rumination, my mind is thinking of things that aren't true. I'm predicting the future. I'm mind reading. I don't actually know what's going on in that person's mind. I don't know what's going to happen. And so when I believe and I live in the things that aren't going to happen, I'm living in things that aren't true versus living in things that are true. And so it's taking yourself back and writing it out. Here's what is true, and reading those truths over and over again and saying, this is where I'm going to live. This is what is true. I didn't mean for this episode for me to be, here's a handy tip for you if you struggle with anxiety, but there you go. If you can get something out of that, go for it. But I'd encourage you to take that idea to a professional counselor, professional therapist, and to get that kind of help yourself. But my point is, in those moments, the peace of God is guarding my heart with truth and my mind with truth, and it's giving me the truth that I can come back to. For whatever reason, my mind, like Paul's, it's prone to anxiety. And I don't know about Paul with depression, but Elijah certainly was prone to depression. The writer of Psalm 88 was prone to depression. And so I'll close with this. I used to blog about depression a fair amount because I never struggled with depression at all in college. Goodness, I probably would have been the last candidate. I felt so secure in college. I didn't really, I mean, there's pressure, but it wasn't real pressure. And so it wasn't until I planted a church. So I was a youth pastor out of college for about a year and a half. I was 21 and 22. I'd graduated college a year early. So for a year and a half, I was youth pastor. No problem with depression, no problem with anxiety. There was nothing resting on my shoulders. There wasn't, I just had to do my job and that was it. And then I planted this church. I was 22 when we did the assessment center and began recruiting. I was 23 when we launched. And here I am launching a church. I'm in the inner city of Lansing. I'm in a very unchurched area. I'm surrounded by 23-year-olds because I was 23. And we had a very small start to our church. And I was expecting a big start to our church. And there's a whole story there. And I've blogged about it before. And if I haven't podcasted about it, let me know. And I will more in the future. But these expectations that I had, and there was these false expectations I had of my own security that was wrapped up in these things. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to be seen as successful. I wanted to be seen as having value. And when we were small and struggling, that wasn't there. But there was also real pressure where, I'd raised tens of thousands of dollars in financial support. Over the course of 3 years, I'm sure I haven't done the math, but over $100,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars maybe in financial support that people were investing into my church and into me. And I had to write prayer updates on the church. And if the church went out of business and it folded, then what an utter failure that would be. And so that was real pressure on me, and I didn't have ways of dealing with it. And so I started sinking into a real depression for the first time. And I was telling a friend of mine how I was feeling, and it was, for me, lack of motivation, never wanting to commit suicide. And I nuanced that because I definitely had times and this is still something I wrestle with, but kind of like Elijah, maybe God just end it. God come back. God kill me. I'm just completely debilitated. I'm a super driven, super motivated person. So feeling like I can't do anything, just paralyzed, and feeling like a wet blanket is put over my brain. So a chemical stoppage in my brain of just slogging through the day and slogging through just sort of this aimless sort of feeling. And I'm just explaining this to my friend. I think we're probably in year 2 of the church plant. And he said, you have depression, because he has depression, and a significant type of depression where he, I don't want to say often, but periodically will have to be hospitalized and has lots of experience and for many years with depression. And so he said, dude, you got to get some help. You got to go to counseling. And so I started going to counseling and eventually got on depression medicine, which I was on for about 10 years. Again, I'm not a doctor. I think for some people, medicine gets them through a season. For others, it's indefinite. Don't talk to somebody more with expertise on that than me. For me, for 10 years, I was on medicine. I was able to go off of the medicine, and for I think 3 years or so, and then just this. Oh, and during that time, I would talk about depression just like I am now, and I would blog on it, and so many people would thank me, and so many people would, for lack of a better word, they would come out and they would say, yeah, I struggle too, and I've never heard a pastor talk about depression like this. It gives me so much more freedom to approach God. It takes away the shame I've been living in. And then when my depression, I guess, sort of went dormant, I didn't talk about it as much and write about it as much. And then this fall, I went through this big transition like I've chronicled on the podcast, and it was just more than I could handle. You know, God will never give you more than you can handle. Actually, yeah, he will. I have a depression blog about that. Yeah, he will. Yeah, he will. He certainly gave Elijah more than he could handle. And he gave the author of Psalm 88 more than he could handle. And so here I am, huge life transition, new job, and I won't get into all of it here, but moving and trying to adjust to a new life after being uprooted from a life I had for 15 years. And depression sets in again in a significant way, and start going to counseling again. I go back on depression medicine. This is all just in the last few weeks. And it just came to me that I need to talk about this again for my own healing, because I found myself cowering back into that place of shame. Cowering as in being fearful and not wanting to talk about this because not wanting to be judged, not wanting to have to go over it. And for me, the healing is in talking about it. The healing is in exposing it. And so when people ask me how I was doing, I just told them, here's how I'm doing. And I rehashed a couple of those blog posts. I'll put a couple of them in the show notes if you are struggling and want to read some of what I wrote about depression. And it just hit me that to do a podcast episode on it, because some of you are struggling, and some of you need that same permission that God has not abandoned you. He loves you. You are still his son. You are still his daughter. Your depression is not a result of your sin. Your depression is not a sin. You are loved. There is hope. There is help. Seek help. Seek counsel. Confide in go to a professional counselor, professional therapist. If that's too big of a jump for you, talk to a close Christian friend about it. I got a friend of mine, they just write their stuff on Facebook. I love it. It's pretty intense, and that's not for everybody, but that's how they expose it, so that they don't feel that shame and that stigma. The stigma. We have to get rid of the stigma that's around it. So I hope that this episode helps you get rid of the stigma that's around it. It helps me to continue to get rid of the stigma around it. You can pray for me. I'm up and down. I feel like I've been getting better, and so I'm really thankful for that. But for me, it's, again, depression's different for everybody. I might feel that way today, and then this afternoon I might crash, or tomorrow morning, or whatever it may be. But I'm relearning. I've been humbled. That's always really healthy, to be able to be reminded of how much I need God and how dependent I am on him, rather than being self-sufficient. And so that's a gift that God has given me that I never would have had outside of my depression. So I will wrap up there. On the topic of depression, feel free to email in podcast@beyondthebattle.net if you want to talk more about depression. I'd be happy to hear from you. If you want to share to the audience anything about depression, I'd be happy to share it. You're always welcome to let me know if you want to be left anonymous, and I'm happy to do that as well. And with that emotional, sobering, serious conclusion to a not lighthearted topic of depression, in typical Flipside fashion, we carry on the tradition of transitioning from something that is sacred and serious to something that is utterly ridiculous. Like going from fifth gear on your car to second gear if you're driving a stick shift, if you've ever been there. We now go to the part of the show that you have been waiting for in anticipation since the very moment you clicked play on episode 21. That's right, Flippopotamuses. Noah's Rant.
Noah's Rant.
All right, I'm going to just warn you ahead of time. I'm going to disappoint some of you. This is not going to be a traditional rant. It'll be good. Hang in there. Don't click off the episode so quickly. Give me a second. The reason it can't be a traditional rant is because I'm guilty of this one as well, which is actually the reason that I'm talking about it on the flip side. And I wasn't going to talk about it as a Noah's Rant, and the more I thought about it, I thought, no, that really does have rant-like quality to it. So, yeah, I know you thought there was nothing that I did ever that was rant-worthy where I would be the one ranted on. But I just did sort of a rant a few minutes ago on how pastors need to share and be vulnerable about their own issues. And so I want to be consistent with that. I want to practice what I preach and share something that I too struggle with. I too have struggles. It is true. Even the venerable Reverend Noah Filipiak struggles. And here's what it is. Okay, so we were on, my team at my job, as far as my small group pastor team, many of us are around the same age. I think there's 6 of us, 7 of us, something like that. Most of us, I would say, are mid-30s. Couple, I think, are early 30s. And there's one guy, my buddy Mike. He wouldn't care if I mention his name on the podcast. Mike, I think, is 44, he told us. So he is the old man of the group. He is the old man. And we were on a small group pastor retreat. This was in early September, so a couple months ago. And Mike made a comment about how often we, the small group pastor team, say the word like. And then he made another comment that was a very millennial thing to do, that is the millennial word. The millennial word is like. And I had a few thoughts. Initially, my response was, I am not a millennial, first and foremost. Because millennials are those people that people always do blog articles about that are entitled and don't have work ethic and all these sorts of things. And then I did a handy Google search. I always thought I was Gen X. Gen X sounds cool. That's just what I always thought I was. So I looked at a Google search, and millennials are born 1981 through 1996. So currently, as of this recording, would be 22 to 37 years old. Like, what the heck? See, I was born in January of 1983. So my 37th birthday is coming up. January 8th, coming up in about a month. Feel free to shower me with gifts. I have no problem with that whatsoever. And here I am. I fall in the millennial category. So, wow. I mean, that in and of itself is, I'm not sure I've recovered from that. But Mike's comment, it made me start to listen. My first thought was, Mike, shut up. And if he heard that, he would laugh. Like, shut up. Get off our case. You're imagining that. You're imagining that. And here's the thing, Mike. You've changed my life. And not for the better. And that's what I'm planning to do here to all of the Flipside listeners. I'm changing your life right now. And I'm going to tell you right now, it is not going to be for the better. Now, don't get me wrong. The purpose of Noah's rant is to make the world a better place. And this rant about saying like, and millennials saying like, it will make the world a better place, but it will not make your life better. See, to make the world a better place, to improve the world, we have got to go to some deep, painful places, and that's where we got to go today. So we're going to bring some pain. And here's what I want you to do. You have an assignment. You have an assignment. First of all, let me say this. Stop for a second. This, again, I started saying, I do this too. So listen, if you're under the age of 40, well, Mike was 44. I've been observing in the last 2 months, really in the last few weeks, more focused observation. Oh, I'll tell you why. Here's why. In the last 2 weeks, it's been more focused observation, and here's why. I confess. Hey, I'm no shame here. We tell it like it is. Lead by example. I listen to my own podcast. I do. Yeah. Got to get those downloads up, you know? I like my podcast. I listen to it. I don't know what that says about me, but I do. I'm a flippo as well. So I was listening to my interview with Jason, episode 20. And I think for the most part, I did a pretty good job of not saying the word like, because here's the thing. Let's use the word broadcasting loosely here. In broadcasting, you don't want to be saying like and all the time. That's not professional. That's poor broadcasting. And so sometimes when I listen, I try to, it's like game film, you know? The tape doesn't lie. So I listen to the podcast and I kind of, okay, I need to tighten it up here, or I want to do better. I want to improve. And so there was a section in the interview, it's towards the end, and I started saying like, I don't remember exactly now what it was, but I was trying to think of something like this and like this, like, and I thought, I do it too. Mike was right. I am guilty of this. And so for my vow was, never say the word like again on your podcast. And then I thought, the only way I could possibly do that is if I eliminate the word like from my vocabulary altogether and I never say it again. And then it hit me how often I say the word like and never even think about it. And then I started observing, and here again, let me pause before I talk about observing how often you all say the word like. You are my friend. I love you. This will not change our friendship. I'm simply pointing out what is. I'm not ranting at you. I'm not ranting at you using the word like in the same way people don't wash their hands after they leave the bathroom, which was a previous rant of mine and is typically what I rant about. That is not this rant. You use the word like a lot. So do I. Or so did I, at least. We'll see how I do going forward. What I want you to do is simply this. Start listening when you talk to people and when you talk, and see how often people say the word like. And there is a correlation. I'm one of the older millennials. Listen to my generation, my millennial generation. I'm going to get myself in trouble here. But particularly, maybe even some of the younger, more middle-aged millennials. See, I'm an older millennial, the middle millennials. I've heard it as much as every other word. Think about how strange that would be if you were writing out the script of a play, or you were drawing a comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes or Spider-Man, and you were writing the dialogue, and in the dialogue, every other word you wrote the word like. How terrible that would sound or look or flow in that comic strip. So that's all I want you to do. I'm going to just leave you with that. I'm planting that seed. It's a virus. It will spread. You cannot remove it from your brain now that I've put it there. You're welcome. Mike did it to me. Now I did it to you. Here's the thing. And look, my wife doesn't listen to this podcast. I can talk about her on here. One of these days, you guys are going to find her. You're going to start ratting me out. I know you will. I know you'll do that. It's okay. That's why I say these things. She says like a lot. And so I said to her, because I want to challenge myself, I want to get better. I said, hey, let's do this thing, because I did this with swearing. And that's a whole nother thing. I've talked about it before, though, where I give a guy $1 every time I swear, and I don't swear anymore. And it worked. It's beautiful. I said to my wife, hey, every time we say like, let's give each other $1, the other person $1, or let's have a massage fund or just something like that, right? And she immediately said, no, I am not going to obsess about saying the word like, not going to put myself under that microscope. And I don't know what it was. I've been married 15 years and I've never noticed. And now, whoo, oh man. So Mike, you've ruined my life is what you've done. And now I'm ruining yours. I'm ruining the millions of listeners that listen to the flip side. Give or take a million. Give or take a few million. Give or take a few million. The millions of listeners that listen to the flip side, I'm now passing it on and ruining your life. So that's my rant. So it's a little different than normal. But I want you to think about it. Tell me. And I even thought, I'm telling you, I legitimately don't want to say the word like anymore. And I thought about it. Could I present some kind of contest to listeners? My wife won't do the contest with me. But if you hear me say the word like on the podcast, if you catch it and you email me, I have to send you $1. Something like that. And that, now, you might laugh. You just said the word like. There's a few times you can say the word like. If I were to say, I like candy, okay, you can say the word like there. So let's be honest. Let's just go over this together. That's an appropriate use of the word like. If I said, what did I just say? Something like that. A game where if you hear me say the word like on the podcast, I have to send you $1. I would do that. I'm game. I'm game for that. At least for the first person that notices it. Not for the millions of listeners. I don't have enough Patreon support for that. But if you're the first person who catches me saying the word like in an inappropriate way, and you put down the timestamp, and you email podcast@beyondthebattle.net, and you tell me the timestamp, and I go listen to it, and there, boom, I'm sending you $1. Bam! Just like that. And then I said something like that. If you have another idea of something like that, that is an appropriate use of the word like. It is okay to do that. In a well-used simile. Remember what a simile is growing up in school? It is comparing something using the words like or as. It's a metaphor, but you've used the word like or as. That is also appropriate, if it is appropriate. Her eyes shone like the stars in the sky. That would be an appropriate use of the word like. What we've done is we've taken that and then we've added that in. I can't even describe to you the ways we use the word like, but it's any other way that you use the word like. And I'm telling you, just start listening for it. It's the epidemic of our world. So we're here to make the world a better place. I'm in. I will spearhead this revival. This is a revival of the English language. It's a revival of how to speak and how to talk. I will not judge you. If you say the word like around me, I won't bat an eye. I will hear it, just like my friend Mike hears it. I will hear it. But I'm done. I'm out. Podcasting, sermons. No more use of the word like. Can I get a hallelujah? I can. Thank you. I'm trying to think of a way to use it. So you like if. That would be a way. You just throw it in there. When you can't think of what to say, you say the word like. That's all I got for you. Thank you for listening. Subscribe if you don't subscribe. Tell your grandma about the flip side. I will see you next time on the flip side.
The Flip Side with Noah Filipiak is a South Francis Press production Copyright Noah Flipiak. www.noahflipiak.com. Theme music by Kyle Lake at K Lake Music. Used with permission. Please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever podcasts are found.
Souls needing revivals, what do I do? Influence like the cup full of that Bombay. Kelly's to them Tom Hanks, Lexus to them Andres. Hoping they can't get my inner reverence, stressing for leverage. That they see the king's tracks on the payment leading to heaven. Yo, dripping in that God that don't perish. People selling fake, see the green around their belly. Taking refuge in his hand, see his poems, my living quarters. Close them when I'm finished, it's time to bring me closer. There's no purgatory, cause you're in or you're out. When you see him in the clouds, you know it's going down. Raise them. They've been sleeping for some ages. Now all God's babies so confused by this hatred. Pulpit preachers shouldn't aim to be A-list. Money probably long, but short is what your days. You ever heard the sound of freedom? Have you ever heard the sound of freedom? Freedom coming quickly. Bars from the spirit. Put it through the preamp and mix it like a chemist. Put it in the airwaves and hoping that they hear it. If there's some confusion, then I hope you see him clearly. Raise them. They've been sleeping for some ages. Now all God's babies so confused by this hatred. Pulpit preachers shouldn't aim to be A-list. Money